Good morning, everyone. I want you to take a moment and do something that I imagine you rarely do, which is to consider the brilliance of a yoke as a farming tool. When was the last time you spent a lot of time thinking about yolks other than egg yolks? Um, this is, in the event that you have not seen it in a while, the curved piece of usually a hardwood species that is fit around the shoulder of whatever animal is strong enough to carry a burden. Right? Usually there are iron rings associated with it so that it can be attached to whatever it is that it is pulling along, a plow, a cart, something heavy. And that word attached is exactly what actually the word yoke means, right? So we also can talk about to be yoked to something is to be attached to it. Right? That's what the word actually meant in its original meaning. So a yoke is a tool for doing that. It's wonderful, and if you're a strong enough animal, then it's not that big of a deal. It's just a way for you to be attached. But as it is with Jesus and his agricultural metaphors for us, rarely when Jesus uses an agricultural metaphor do you and I get to be the pleasurable recipients of that. Usually he's kind of underhandedly mocking us a little bit. Because you see, you and I are not beasts of burden. We're pretty terrible at doing the heavy work and carrying the heavy load. We are wearied by these yokes that we have on our necks. And because of that, Jesus can say what is perhaps one of the most famous and beloved of all of the passages that he gets to say to all of us. Come to me, you that are wearied and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The yoke that you have, he might say, is heavy and too heavy for you to bear. So let me change it for you. This is the way that he describes his ministry to us and our ministry to each other. This yoke. Let me change that for you so that you can have the experience of a yoke that is easy and a burden that is light. So think about it for a minute. What is it that wearies you? What is the burden that you just can't carry on your own? What is your yoke? In my thoughts, there are two different sort of categories for what these yokes are. There is the category of those things that are just a part of this world that we live in, the burden of injustice, the burden of scarcity or death or sin. The way that the Jewish storytellers who wrote the Hebrew Bible would say, these were the yokes that were fashioned as a part of the consequences when the very first humans rebelled against God, and they have been perfected through the years, transmitted from generation to generation to generation, or replicated from generation to generation, and they hand them to you. There's not much you can do about it. You can't control this world. And so you experience grief. You experience suffering and pain. You experience addiction. You experience turmoil. You experience people handing you a yoke that you would not choose for yourself, that reminds you that this world falls so short of the paradise that God has created for us. And it's a burden that is so hard to bear. Or if you are like me, perhaps that burden doesn't weigh you down as much anymore because instead you've traded it out for a burden that you find more favorable. My yoke I have carefully crafted through the years. The world probably handed me the raw material, the wood itself and the iron, but I have been shaping it with my own two hands and with my tools of my pride and my ego for many, many years. It's the burden that comes alongside holding resentment, choosing to hold resentment instead of forgive. The burden that comes alongside believing myself to be so important that I think, well, if I don't work hard and work harder and work harder, then something will break without my input, right? I can't possibly step back. I'm too important. The hard work that comes alongside believing that I ought to and can be better and better and better. And that eventually, if I am better enough, I might be better enough to change the people around me and make them better too. This is a custom-built yoke, curved for just my shoulders exactly. And unfortunately, because of the way it is, it's the sort of thing that when the burden becomes so intolerable, the burden of carrying all of this pride and this ego, when I ought to hand it over first, instead it is the moment that I say, no, this one is precious to me. I've been working so hard on it. Jesus, you can't have this one. This one's mine. And the burden gets worse and worse. To us who carry the yoke of a world around us that is in turmoil, and for those of us who carry the yokes that we build ourselves on our own pride, Jesus offers a chance to exchange them for his own work. Even to take what is ours, my most precious yoke, and to change it and to hand it back to me to be an instrument of peace, he would say, of refreshment for your soul. It's a bizarre concept, but for a yoke of resentment, Jesus says, no, take this burden, the burden of forgiveness. Forgiveness is work. It is hard work, but it's the one that you will find refreshing, and resentment will just kill you. For sin, he says, let me give you the yoke of mercy and atonement. It's not easy to determine that something in your life is sinful and that you need to walk away from it. But I promise you, if you do that, you'll find that that burden is refreshing and will restore your soul. For addiction and oppression and slavery, he offers freedom. For despair, he offers hope. For shame, he offers the honor of being called a child of God. For whatever it is that causes you pain, Jesus offers to take your most painful part, your most painful yoke, and transform it into your greatest asset, an instrument of peace for you and for those around you. And that might be the most important part, that it's for you and for those around you. Because if you imagine this yoke being about just your shoulders, you picked the wrong image. Yokes are about attaching you to other people also. To take one ox and another ox and allow them both to travel the same direction and put their power together. That's why Jesus chooses to use this, I think, as a metaphor. He does the transforming work of taking whatever pain might be transmitted to another person and instead change it so it can be peace. He does that work that you and I might do the work of carrying one another's burdens. And when you and I find it hardest to carry what is about our shoulders, we can look to the person next to us and the person in the pew in front of us, or two pews in front of you, and find out that they are putting their shoulders to this task also. It's the way that Christ built his church. That you and I, on the day where we need the church most, where we are suffering the greatest under the weight of whatever it is that oppresses us, you and I might find someone else that can help carry it. As Paul says in Galatians, to shoulder one another's burdens and therefore to fulfill the law of Christ. When you and I need it the least, when you and I feel like everything's fine and we have already found refreshment for our souls, that we might still be together. Because when you need it the least, someone else needs it the most. That's why it is so important for us to be in this community together. It is what Christ is up to in this church and every other church that Christ has ever made. He's about the business of taking your painful past and turning it into an instrument of peace and love for others. It is the model that he gave himself when he took an instrument of pain and torture and execution and death in the cross and turned it into the instrument of redemption for others. Whatever your pain is, that's what Christ is up to. And when it feels like it's crushing you, know that if you come to Christ and hand it over, Christ can do that for you, even as people walk alongside you to help shoulder your burden. This past Friday, at the end of the men's Bible study, I asked what I was thinking would be a rhetorical question. It was 8 o'clock. It was time to go. And I said, tell me when you have experienced this happen in your life. When have you felt so burdened by something that you exchanged it for the yoke that Christ offered? And tell me about whether or not that was easy and peaceful and refreshing. The room was silenced as one of our parishioners described a year that by all accounts would be called hellacious. A year in which he lost his spouse. A year in which he lost a grandchild. A year in which family tragedy and personal tragedy after tragedy after tragedy continue to occur. Those two just being at the top of the list, but the list is long. He described how as he came into this community and approached Jesus, as he did what Jesus said, "Come to me when you are weary and heavy laden, and take my yoke upon you." As he did that, he found peace in the midst of chaos and turmoil. As he understood more and more that there was not a thing that he could do in the world to change the world or to bring his family back, he somehow still found peace. And as he found peace, he also found himself surrounded by love in this community. As he spoke about it, it was also clear that other people saw in him something they longed for in themselves. And I could see from my vantage point the beginning of that work, that his most painful past was being turned into his greatest asset to help others find peace and refreshment for their souls. I want to experience that in my life. I imagine you do too. Wouldn't you love to know that in the redeeming hands of God, whatever causes you the most pain in your life can be transformed rather than transmitted and changed into something that can provide peace to others? It can be done. Together, we can do it, shouldering one another's burdens and coming to Christ. That Christ might take what we believe to be ours upon himself and give us instead what is only his to give: peace and the restoration of our souls. Amen.